Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow Him in the ways that He's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and this episode is going to be about the fear of the Lord. Now, this comes on the heels of a deeper event that I just did that has to do with the whole concept of the fear of the Lord, because it's a difficult biblical concept and one that we can struggle with in figuring out what does fear have to do with love. And if I'm afraid of God, is that going to make me want to draw away from Him? And part of the core way of understanding the whole concept of the fear of the Lord is in contrast to the fact that the most frequent command throughout the Old and New Testament is do not fear or don't be afraid. We are only told to fear God. We're not meant to fear anyone or anything else. So the Israelites are constantly being told, don't be afraid of this army, or don't be afraid of this ruler, or don't be afraid of these rumors that are of something bad that's gonna happen to you. Fear God alone. And when you fear God, that simply means, it means many things, but at the very least, it means we make decisions based on the reality of God and how He might act, instead of making decisions based on the reality of other people and how they may act. And so what I want to do in this episode is talk specifically about the idea that if we fear God, what does that have to do with fearing other people? Or how does that produce the contrast, the antidote to the fact that so many of us crave the affection of others? And just think about this for a second, just the concept of fear and that whole idea. When we think of fear, it can be one of the most primal emotional realities that we experience. I remember this one time that when I was younger, I was with a group of people and we did this outdoor ropes course. And at the end of it, after we'd done all these activities, we were supposed to stand just on the top of this pole and then jump off it onto a swing that we would grab onto. And so you're standing on the top of this pole that's just wide enough for your feet to be on it. And you're dealing with the internal anxiety, but when we would get ready to jump, we would find that our knees and our feet and our legs were just shaking involuntarily because of the primal instinct of fear, the idea that I'm not sure that I should be able to stand on this thing. I'm not sure of what's going to happen when I jump. Fear can be one of the most powerful emotional realities that we experience. And powerfully enough, the greatest fear for many people is the fear of speaking in front of other people, which in the end isn't a fear that's about speaking. It's a fear that's about other people. It's about the whole idea that we crave the approval of other people. We want them to like us. We want them to think highly of us. And the idea that they would disapprove of us can be deeply crippling to us. And if it is crippling to us, then that means that we're going to make a lot of decisions in light of the fact that we need people to like us and we need people to approve of us. That's going to lead to us compromising our convictions. That's going to lead to us not taking risky steps of faith. That's going to lead to us abstaining from saying things that God is calling us to say, to make bold statements of faith, and instead to make cowardly acts instead. The whole idea of the fear of man is something that we're meant to fight. And so what I want to talk about in this episode is 3 ways that we combat the fear of people. 3 ways that we combat desperately craving the approval of other people. And for each one, there's going to be a passage or a couple passages that I'll touch on. So the first one is this. The first way that we combat our craving for the approval of other people is that we soak ourselves in the reality of God's judgment. In other words, we live, we actively look to live in the reality and remind ourselves of the reality that God is the one and only judge. Now, there's a curious passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 where the Apostle Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, what he's often doing is talking about the fact that they crave seeing leaders and even spiritual leaders that have powerful voices and a powerful presence, and Paul doesn't really make the grade in that regard. So here's what he says at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 4. This then is how you ought to regard us, as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Now I'll pause, I'll say what he says next, but that's a big statement by Paul right there. Just think of the freedom that comes along with that. Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and he knows they're not impressed by him. They're not impressed by his physical presence. They're not impressed at his speaking ability. They're not impressed by these. And he says, I care very little if I'm judged by you guys or by any human court. I care very little if you guys end up deciding that I don't make the grade. And what you might expect is that the next thing that Paul is going to say, at least if he was living in 21st century America, the next thing that he would say is, I don't need your approval. The only person's approval I need is my own. Because that's part and parcel with the message of 21st century United States culture. The idea, I'm beautiful, I don't care what they say. I approve of myself. I think highly of myself. I am my only judge. What you say doesn't matter. Paul agrees that what others are saying doesn't ultimately matter, but it's not because he thinks he is his own judge. In fact, let me read the whole verse now. He says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Now that's powerful right there. He says, I don't even judge myself, because if I looked at myself and said, I'm making the grade, I'm doing great, I think highly of myself, I think I'm important, I think that people should hold me in high esteem. That's my judgment of myself. Paul says, well, that doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter what I even think about myself. God is the one and only judge. If we are going to combat the idea that we will live in the fear of what other people think of us, then we have to start by soaking ourselves in the reality that God is the one and only judge. Now, on the surface, that might sound like that's a difficult or oppressive idea, that we're constantly looking over our shoulder at God's judgment, but just take in this reality for those of us who are believers in Jesus. What we come to find out is that we are approved of before God, not because we've made the grade, but because Jesus has made the grade. In Romans chapter 8, verse 1, Paul writes that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We don't face final judgment. So ultimately, we start from the reality that in God's judgment, from a final judgment standpoint, we are rescued. We are justified. We are part of the family of God. So the idea that I'm looking at somebody else and saying, do I make the grade in his eyes? Who cares if I make the grade in his eyes? God has received me as his son, as his adopted child. Now, this doesn't take away the idea that God is still going to approve of or disapprove of different things that we do, but it allows us to live in light of the reality of what he's called us to do, not being frightened that we're ultimately going to be cast off, but by saying God is our Father and he's going to judge us as a father. He's going to discipline us and guide us as a father, and I want to live in light of what he says is most important. Paul says, you know how I get to the point of not caring what other people think? Because I've soaked myself in the reality that God alone is judge. And God's first judgment is that I am rescued through Jesus, and every judgment after that is for my good, because he's my Father. So that's the first way that we combat the idea of seeking the approval of others, that we soak ourselves in the fact that God is the one and only judge. The second way that we combat this, and this might sound a little bit strange, but the second way that we combat the fear of other people is by playing out in our minds what would be the worst thing that this person could do to me or could enact against me if they end up disapproving of me. Now, in order to say why I say that that's a good thing for us to do, let me read a couple passages. The first one is from Jesus himself, Matthew 10:28. He says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And by the way, in case you're just kind of taking in that verse and not aware of it, when I was growing up and heard that verse, I thought he was talking about the devil there. I thought he was saying, don't be afraid of a human being who can kill you, be afraid of the devil who can send you into hell. He's not talking about the devil. He's talking about God. He's saying, don't fear other people. The worst they can do is kill your body. Fear God, because he ultimately has sway over final judgment. And similarly, a statement in Psalm Psalm 56, verses 10 through 11. He says, "In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust and am not afraid. What can man do to me?" There's this great, liberating, defiant statement in both of these passages that says, what is the worst somebody who disapproves of me can do to me? And Jesus even points towards this thing when he says, well, what's the worst they can do to you? I guess it's to kill you. Now that's pretty bad. Like that is, we got to give some points to that. But even Jesus says, it's not that bad. I mean, ultimately, you'll be judged by God. And that's the thing you should be really concerned about. So if the worst that they can do is kill you, not even that bad in the grand scheme of things. But still, for us as human beings, we'd say, well, that's pretty bad. The fact is, most people whose approval we are desperately seeking are not people who are threatening our lives. They're people who might be threatening our reputation in some way or our sense of self-esteem. But just think about this for a second. Think about that person whose approval you desperately crave, and then think, if I didn't have their approval, what would it be that would happen? What exactly would fall apart if this person didn't approve of me? And it can be a scary exercise to do, but what you often come to is the liberating reality that the world won't crumble if that person doesn't approve of you. You could say, well, maybe they won't be my friend anymore. Maybe they'll write something nasty about me on Facebook. Maybe they'll fire me in some situation. You might have something like that. Maybe they'll sneer at me. Maybe they'll make fun of me. Most of the things that they can end up doing to us aren't that cataclysmically troublesome. They're things that we could end up moving on from. And that breaks part of the power. And Jesus, I think, is breaking the power here when he says, what's the worst this person's going to do to you? Kill you? All right, well, they kill you. Ultimately, if you're doing the right thing, ultimately, if your faith is in God, you're going to be fine. If we can get to the point of breaking the power that people have over us by saying, all right, well, what would be the worst thing that could happen? What would be the worst thing that they would do to me if I just decided I wasn't going to cave, I wasn't going to compromise, I wasn't going to seek their approval at the expense of my own identity and integrity? What's the worst that would happen? I think Jesus is inviting that kind of thought. And when we do that kind of thought, it breaks the power that people have over us. And so if we're going to combat this whole idea of fearing people, all right, we want to soak ourselves in the fact that God is the one and only judge. We also want to mentally go down that road and do that exercise to say, all right, what would actually happen? Would the world end if this person disapproved of me? And the third way that we can combat this is by beginning to pray for the people that we fear. And the reason that I say this is when we look at the people whose approval we so desperately want, and we begin to see them as somebody deeply loved by God, it breaks the power of the fact that we need their approval. It helps us to see them as just another person. Jesus made a statement, while he doesn't use the word fear in this passage, it's right along the same lines. It's John chapter 5, verse 44. And he's speaking to the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And he says, "How can you believe, since you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from the only God?" And so the point Jesus is making here is he says, all right, you're not going to come to the point of believing in me. You're not going to receive faith in Jesus. And the reason you're not going to is because you are obsessed with receiving glory from one another. And you know that believing in Jesus doesn't get you ahead, doesn't get you approval of the people that you consider to be really, really important. So he says, you can't believe because you're seeking approval from one another and not approval from God. Now just think about this for a second. So first of all, that blocks, if we're seeking approval from other people, that blocks our ability to seek glory from God. But also it makes us think about Jesus. So think, all right, so Jesus seems to be indicating that the way that he lives his life is not by seeking the approval of the powerful people around him, but by seeking the approval of God. Now, if you think, well, if I didn't care what the people around me thought, I would just sort of throw them off, I'd be rude to them, I'd cast them out, I wouldn't worry about them at all. Just look at the life of Jesus and ask yourself, was Jesus the kind of person that loved others or that disregarded others? Jesus was the most loving man who ever walked the earth. He was love incarnate. So Jesus not seeking the approval of others didn't make it harder for him to love others. It actually made it easier for him to love others. Because when you're seeking somebody's approval, it's usually not because you love them a lot. It's because in some desperate way you've convinced yourself that you need them. You want something from them. You want the approval from them, and then you can cast them out and move on with your life. If we truly want to be able to love other people, we need to stop being afraid of what they think of us. And to me, one of the ways of breaking the power of that is if you look at the person whose approval that you desperately want, and you say, you know what, I'm going to just start praying for this person because they're a real human being too, and they have needs. And maybe I'm kind of mad at them that they don't approve of me right now, but instead I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray for God's great work in their life. I'm going to pray for God to liberate them from the different things that are holding them back. Or if they're not a Christian, I'm going to pray that God brings them to a saving faith in himself and gives them the joy and liberation that comes from faith in Jesus. When you flip the script and say, this is not a person that I need to use so that I get something from them, and instead, this is a person that I want to be a servant to. I'm not going to fear them. I'm going to serve them. I'm not going to try to get approval from them. I'm going to try to help them in any way that God would allow me to help them. It breaks the power, and you see this other person just as another person, not as a person that has some deep power over your life. The fear of the Lord is a huge, significant theme in the scriptures. It's something that's very important for how we live our lives before God. And one of the great liberating things that happens when we fear God is that we stop fearing other people. And when we stop fearing other people, we can live in the joy of just seeking God's approval and following his lead. And it also brings us the joy of being able to love other people instead of feeling like we desperately need their approval. So my thoughts for you is 3 ways that we can do this. Soak in the reality that God is the one and only judge and that other people don't get a vote in that. And then beyond that, play out in your mind what would actually happen. Break the power of that crippling fear that's making your knees tremble. And then finally, lift up in prayer and reach out in ways to serve those whose approval that you want, because that will help break the power of seeing them as somebody that has sway over your life, and instead as seeing them with a fellow journeyer along the way. If you want to see other episodes of the LBF Church podcast, you can go to our church website, lbf.church, and you can click on the little tab that says blog and podcast. And we've got lots of past videos there from other episodes that we've done. You can also just go and download LBF Church podcast and find the audio from past episodes. Always appreciate it when there's comments or questions, or if you leave a review or a rating. That's always helpful because we want to get the word out to more people so that they grow in their affection toward Jesus and grow more equipped to follow him in the ways that he's leading. So thanks for taking the time to take this in. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.